Hey guys, welcome back to Enlightened Tale. It's your host Kev here. Hope you're all doing well. I'd like to thank everybody who sent me messages and reached out to me on that first video. Seems like it was well received, which is fantastic for me. In this video, we're going to be touching on one character who was referenced, which was Dores in that video. We're also going to be talking about someone else called Dictys in this video. So I hope you're all comfortable and you're all ready, and without further ado, let's get straight into it. I mentioned in the intro video numerous different works around the Iliad and a few of the researchers whose work had helped me build a picture of the landscape and the characters of the alleged 10-year war. In this video, we are going to look at another character whom I did not mention. This character is one Dictys Cretinis, who apparently came from Crete, as well as Dores Phrygius, who came from Phrygia, and get an understanding of who these individuals allegedly are. Both Dictys and Dores, as we shall see moving forward, frequently contradict Homer, in spite of the fact that he was obviously the ultimate source of much of the modern interpretations, as discussed previously, being the A Scholia in the Vinicius A manuscript, which of course, as we said, there was no originals that survived of those documents either. Both writers claim to give accurate accounts, with both actually claiming to have lived at the time of the Trojan War, whereas Homer lived much later, if he lived at all. Again, I will discuss this specifically in a video on Homer at some point down the line. Dictys states that he is a follower of Idomeneus, the leader of the Cretans, whilst Dores is perhaps to be identified with the priest of Vulcan, or that's otherwise known as Hephaestus to the Greeks, first mentioned in Iliad 5:9, and a potential follower of the Trojan Antenor, though there are other theories around Dores, as we shall see later in this video. Thus, if we can believe in the potentiality that these authors were a primary source of information for the events they describe, and Homer, wherever he fails to agree with these two, could be wrong. Dores' writings appear more pro-Trojan, and as so more anti-Homeric than Dictys in his descriptions, perhaps because of the notion that Homer had favoured the Greeks. Dictys' writings is known as Dictys of Crete and is translated into Latin by Lucius Septimus. So we will notice in the writings by Dores, whose writing was also translated into Latin, whom we discussed briefly in that initial intro video, the first video, many of the names of places, gods and people are given from a Roman perspective, and since the original writings do not survive, we can thus assume a certain amount of projection of personal preference used in the Roman wording and influence of the culture during these translations. For a long time, many scholars did not believe that the Greek/Achaean Dictys had ever existed. However, in the winter of 1899 to 1900, a Greek papyrus fragment closely corresponding to a portion of the current Latin text that was found on the back of, get this, an income tax returns for the year 206 AD, which was composed much later than the found Greek papyrus fragment, alleged to be translated from a Greek original. Furthermore, the papyrus fragment indicated that this was a free translation and not a literal, or a word-for-word translation, you might say, whose present title in the works in Latin is De Excedio Troiae Historia, or The Fall of Troy, a History, was probably added later by someone who was influenced by the first sentence of the letter which Dores the Phrygian wrote about the Greeks and the Trojans. The works of the two have somewhat become synonymous with each other over the millennia, given their contrast to the Homeric versions. The following comparison of the same passage in the Greek papyrus fragment and in the Latin translation clearly illustrates a greater fullness of the latter, as we shall see. Moreover, even before the discovery of the papyrus fragment, it was quite certain that the Latin writings of Dictys could not be a literal translation of a Greek original, for its style is heavily indebted to the influence of earlier Latin literature, which ties into what I said before, that the Romanization of the originals was always going to carry in the translating of the older material, reflected personal ideology and of course the geopolitical landscape. Here is the reference quote translated from that papyrus parchment. The Trojans raise a mournful cry and groan. Troilus mourns his fate in a pitiable fashion, remembering his very early age, who in the first years of childhood with shame and in value, and especially in the shape of the body, he grew up loved and accepted by the people. Unquote. The translator has imitated, this is according to Phrygia, who done translations from the Latin material into English. The translator has imitated Palaeolus, Terence, Cicero, Livy, Caesar, Cornelius, Nepos, Virgil, and especially Sallust. Indeed, it is believed by some the influence of Sallust has been detected in more than 350 places. For instance, in the passage quoted just then, of which I translated into English using a Google translator, the words acceptus popularibus, for which there is no equivalent in the Greek, is probably derived from the Seleucian term acceptum popular. The P's get me. Acceptum popularibus. Dara's works are known to us in a medieval Latin version only, with no Greek iterations currently known. This Latinized Dara's is introduced by a letter whose author claims that he is the Latin translator of an original Greek Dara's, and that he has made a word-for-word translation. Yet since no papyrus or parchment fragment of a Greek original has been found, we must test these claims in other ways. For example, Schissel von Flechenberg has given two main reasons for believing that a Greek text of Dara's once existed. First, the Latin text for the description of heroes and heroines in sections 12 and 13 depends on the same source as the Byzantine writer Malalas, who was known to not know Latin. Secondly, some postulate the influence of a Greek original can be detected in the wording of the Latin translation. There are moreover references to Dara's which go as far back as Ptolemy of Chenos, or Ptolemy Chenos, in the 1st century AD, probably soon after the Greek text of Dara's was allegedly by some composed. Thus some theories that the author of the letter is, as he says, the translator of the original Greek work, though this claim that he made a simple word-for-word translation cannot be entirely true. As I say, a chap named Schissel von Flechenberg has described this Latin Dara's translation as a compilation consisting of the following, and I quote from Schissel. Now, what a name that is, by the way, Schissel. Sections 1 through 10 of Dara's describes events which happened before the Trojan War, such as the adventures of the Argonauts, which the translator compiler has taken from this Latin source and prefixed it to his work. Unquote. This could be seen as an indicator that certain elements never belonged to the original Latin works of Dara's, given, as we have already discussed in the previous video, that Darius makes references to the death of Laomedon, the father of Priam, who was king of Troy during the Trojan War. The case against this is bolstered further by the fact that the texts are derived from Latin and not from a Greek source, like the hard copy. To quote Phrygia, whom is the only current translation of both these men's works I have read or come across so far. Skip too far. Quote, "They betray their Latin origin in mistakes no Greek would make. For instance, Peleus is called the King of the Peloponnese in sections 5 through 10, which appear to be based on the work of the Latin author Dracontius." Unquote. This brings into doubt also the notion that the originals were written in an Ionian Greek format. So there we go, that was a little bit technical, that part of the video there, discussing the potentiality of the text either being Latin, or whether they were only ever Latin, or if they potentially were also of a Greek origin. Now, I guess it's up in the air. There's no conclusive answer on that, so we'll kind of leave that one there because there's nothing to tie it off with, unfortunately. We find in these writings Darius the Phrygian apparently did military service at one point at Troy, and how he saw the major players of the war during times of truce or when fighting. We see also that he stayed on at Troy as a faithful follower of Antenor, and how the writings that Darius wrote gives the number of casualties on both sides, which is an interesting tidbit. The connection with Antenor, which is comparable to Dictys' connection with Idomeneus, explains how Darius was able to survive the war, and so to write his version of the history. Antenor had helped the Greeks to bring the war to an end, and they, being grateful, had left him and his party unharmed, and we discussed that. Say we're doing more of the technical stuff here. As we come further down the line, we're going to actually break the stories down, and I'll read the stories to you so you actually know. It's a bit more interesting, the stories, to be honest, rather than all this technical stuff, but we need to get it in there. In order to keep this video from becoming too big, these points of interest we shall cover in a later video, as we still have things to discuss around the writers themselves. I will briefly, however, note that Homer has been accused of playing favourite with certain heroes. For example, why does he completely ignore Palamedes and mentions Troilus only once? The two authors, who have differing accounts, emphasise these and other characters slighted by Homer in greater context. Darius does this especially, for in his account, Palamedes and Troilus, a prince of Troy, play more prominent roles than Dictys' version. Troilus is not to be confused with Tithonus, who is also a prince of Troy. Check out a video I made regarding Tithonus, who was son of the king Laomedon and the lover of the goddess Eos, or the Romanized Aurora, who was the goddess of the dawn and who was also the sister of the moon goddess. Polyxena is another character never mentioned by Homer. Achilles does not fall in love with her in the Iliad as he does in Dictys and Darius' versions. For Homer's Achilles is the embodiment of the heroic ideal according to which the virtues of manly courage and personal honour are prized above life and easy living. In Dictys and Darius' work, an enamoured Achilles is ambushed and killed in the temple of Apollo, said to be a neutral zone, where he has come to bargain with the enemy for Polyxena's hand in marriage. And to be honest, it's time for a little segue. As I mentioned at the start of the video, I want to touch on something else. Sorry. This talk of Achilles makes me think of the Vikings, to be honest, with the Norse men of Scandinavia putting their emphasis on a form of warrior's code, with all warriors hoping to gain access to Valhalla in the afterlife. Achilles, who we shall cover in a video of his own, is portrayed in the Iliad as vengeful, proud, and petty. As the book progresses, the image of Achilles as a spiteful child, some might say, changes dramatically. Towards the end of the epic, Achilles begins to exhibit qualities that are considered heroic, becoming the bravest, handsomest, greatest warrior of the army of Agamemnon. To be honest, I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from Book 1 of the Iliad right now. Sing, O goddess, the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus, that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans. Many a brave soul did it send hurrying down to Hades, and many a hero did it yield a prey to dogs and vultures. For so were the councils of Zeus filled with the day on which the son of Atreus, king of men, and great Achilles first fell out with one another. So I'm not going to continue on to that. We might come back to some of that stuff, like I say, when we do the actual Achilles video, but that just goes to show you straight in the start of Book 1, written by Homer. He identifies straight away that Achilles is, he's a handful. As mentioned previously, Achilles was fair with bright eyes, which takes me, well, for me, I take to mean as fair-skinned and blue-eyed. Though this interpretation has many people speculating on various forms of Homer's wording, though the descriptive word of exanthos by Homer is generally taken to mean blonde hair. Any one of these points alone are insignificant. However, the combination of such descriptions has allowed me to ponder whether we are looking at the roots of Thor in the Norse mythology. I would not bet my house on this, though the characteristics and the potentiality of the war taking place in England, so close to Scandinavia, is indeed fascinating. Indeed, giving as reference previously that the medieval author Snorri Sturluson claims that Asgard went by the name Troy. As I said, we shall cover Achilles in more detail also in a later video regarding his actions of the war and the history/mythology of him himself and the people around him. Now, I will just say there, because some people are probably like rolling their heads, I'm not saying that Thor is Achilles, but when you think about it, if this war did take place over 3,000 years ago, then we're reaching straight back, like right back into antiquity. And he's fair with blonde hair, bright-eyed, and he was a great warrior. Now, according to some various authors whose books I've got scattered around me right now, the Achaeans potentially came from Scandinavia, and if this is true, then I think it's an interesting connection. Like I said, I wouldn't bet my house on it, but it is fascinating. Troilus was a prince of Troy and son of King Priam. Troilus would ultimately meet his end at the hands of the Achaean hero Achilles, as we mentioned near the start of the video. And to be honest, we'll cover this, as I say, and more of the stories of the Iliad and the Dictys of Crete, Dictys the Phrygius. Like, we'll cover all these stories and look for the differences in between them all. Whilst the opposite ideal is represented by Paris, being enamoured of Helen, sacrifices the good of this country to satisfy his desire. So he's the opposite of Achilles, really. Though that'd be Achilles at the end of the Iliad, not at the start. The great Achilles becomes no better than Paris. In the traditional account, a heroic Achilles meets his end while fiercely attacking the city of Troy. But back to the focus of this video. Most of what we have just discussed regarding Dictys and Dictys was extrapolated from the Phrygia translation of the pair's writings. We shall now look at some further context. In the medieval period, it seems that most European scholars used the writing of Darius the Phrygian and told the story from his perspective. Whether they directly quoted his work, the history and destruction of Troy, or not. As mentioned, the Venetius A was seemingly written around the 10th century, and as such, it was after this period that Homer reappeared in the literature, and the tale was then retold, after the Middle Ages from his perspective, as given his poems had a greater volume of material. And as I say, that's a pretty thick book, that. Homer actually does reference a person called Darius in his poems. Quote, "Now there was amid the Trojans one Darius, a rich man and blameless, a priest of Hephaestus, and he had two sons, Phrygius and Idaeus, both well skilled in all manner of fighting." Unquote. If, as suggested by this reference by Homer, that the two men were both alive and present during the conflict, could it be possible that these observers of the conflict knew each other and actually met? Imagine that. Iman Wilkins seems to think so. Here is a quote from Iman's book. "Homer seems surprised to the sons of Darius make an appearance on the battlefield. He must have met Darius before the war, since he knew his name, function, wealth, status and reputation, as well as his number of sons, with their names, without having access to the city. They must therefore have met before the war, probably where they had received their education from a mystery school, which we shall touch on in a later video, because that is some interesting stuff there." Unquote, by the way. The question of whether these two Dariuses are of one and the same is generally accepted to be the case by modern scholars. I should mention now that there is a consensus amongst a number of historians that believe the war potentially taking place in East Anglia, that the war was one of a Celtic origin, as I touched on before when I mentioned Scandinavia, and Argos being in France and all this kind of stuff. Here is a quote now from Homer that I referenced in that first video. "Math and Hyved, masters of magic and wand, had liberated the elements." Unquote. This quote seems as though it is one of a Celtic origin, at least to me. To quote Iman again here, who does believe Homer was in fact a priest of the Achaeans. Quote, "Homer must have been a druid in the Achaean camp and a witness of the Trojan War, just as Darius, whose descriptions of the war are so detailed they are often considered eyewitness accounts. Hitherto," which is a fantastic word, "Darius Phrygius was always believed to have been from Phrygia in Asia Minor. However, in the Bronze Age, there was already two regions in northwestern Europe called Phrygia." Hey guys, just a quick little note to add to the video while I'm doing the edit. Burning the midnight oil, as you do. Forgot to mention where Phrygia in northern Europe was. Now, there's one in Scotland and another one in Flanders in France. I'll leave that there because we'll probably touch on that again in a future video, but just in case anyone's wondering, there you go. Which is phonetically the Greek transcription of Phrygia, that's F, Phrygia, not PH, situated on both sides of the North Sea. Before the name was transported to a region in Turkey after 800 BCE. The name Darius may well be preserved in England with the town names of Daresbury in Cheshire, as previously mentioned, and one I've just discovered myself, Darsham in East Anglia. Unquote. There is much more information to come on the Celtic/Druid connection as we move forward. So as you can see there's a lot of information from varying perspectives, which may or may not be authentic, much like Homer's works itself. I mean authentic as in like original accounts, you know. We don't have the original writings of any of this stuff. Like, and as we just discussed in this video here, whether it's Dictys, Dictys, or Homer, we don't have the originals, especially when it comes to Homer, as discussed in the A Scholia, to Phrygius A. And when it comes to Dictys and Dictys, we don't even know if they were written in Latin. And to be honest, I didn't realise I've got a bit more typed out here. I just wanted to discuss these chroniclers a little more before discussing the Homeric poems, as Homer's works, or should I say the latter iterations of his works, are more well known than the writings of these two and the source material in their own right. Anything else to add there? No, and the rest is blank. So yeah, like I say, the Homeric poems are a lot more full-bodied. There's a lot more to break down in there, so I thought I'd start with Dictys and Dictys. Thought we'd get their information out, and then we can discuss Homer, and then as we move forward we can get an understanding of the different perspectives, where they're coming from when we start breaking down the actual stories in the war and in all of it really, to be honest. The locations, the climate, the ecosystem, the geography, the language, you know, there's so many facets and so many elements that need to be discussed later down the line. And like I say, we're just moving forward here step by step, putting some foundations in place. And to be honest, I'm going to leave it there. Like I say, hopefully this wasn't too boring of a video. It's probably going to be one of the more boring videos I actually do on this topic, which is why, like I say, I wanted to try and get this stuff out the way. But yeah, I'd like to thank anyone for stopping by. Don't forget to hit a like, subscribe, share this video around if you feel it was good, you know, if you feel like I'm doing a good job. And yeah, hope you all stay safe. I'll catch you in the next video.